Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong says Singapore has no choice but to be active on smaller-scale multilateral platforms. Even as the world becomes increasingly fragmented, Mr. Lee, who will hand over power to Deputy Prime Minister Lawrence Wong in the coming days, also touched on how to maintain Singapore's economic edge. CNA's Jeraldine Yap tells us more.
When Mr. Lee Hsien Loong was made Prime Minister 20 years ago, countries were pursuing free trade and globalization. The world was prospering based on equal opportunity, and the US was the dominant power. Speaking to local reporters ahead of a political transition, Mr. Lee says things could not be more different. China is now much stronger, while tremendous tensions exist among major powers.
We are dealing with a very troubled world. Confidence in free trade has also been shaken. People now talk about first they talked about fair trade. That means I don't want it to be so free. Then they talk about national security considerations, which are important. Resilience. What if you become hostile to me? What if there's COVID? That's important too. Then they talk about reshoring, bringing it back home. Do it at home. But that sounds protectionist. And they talk about friend-shoring. I will do business with friends. Now, who's my friend? So it's a very troubled external environment. And we are sailing into it.
Mr. Lee says the new geopolitical landscape and Singapore's connectedness to the world are impacting the way the country conducts its foreign policy.
In the old days, foreign policy is foreign policy, and what's domestic? Well, Singaporeans will leave the foreign policy to the government. But today, you're so exposed. You've got the internet, you've got social media, you've got WhatsApp, you've got TikTok, you've got people traveling. And you've got all sorts of things coming in, and Singaporeans being influenced by videos, by memes, by messages. So your foreign policy and domestic situation has been linked together. So we have to adapt to that, and our foreign policy has to adapt to that.
But Mr. Lee says certain realities for Singapore don't change.
We're still a little red dot, a bit redder, but still little. We are still depending on an international rule of law, on international trade, on our sea lines of communications being open, being able to talk to everyone in the world and do business and get our food and our supplies, and needing to protect our interests where everybody is jostling with one another, and we are not the biggest person in the discussion.
Mr. Lee acknowledges that interests can be subjective and there is no formula to balance competing priorities. Sometimes, he says, the government may have a position on a matter and will have to explain it to Singaporeans.
Before I took over in 2004, you may have forgotten, but I made a trip to Taiwan as TPM. And it caused a rumpus. And I had to state my position. So my first National Day rally, I had to spend time talking about not just foreign policy, but that trip to Taiwan and why I went and why it's important to us and why Singapore's national interest required me to do that, and that it was necessary for me to do so, even though it caused a kerfuffle at that time. And that's the sort of thing which happens. And during the last 20 years, heaven knows, there have been other occasions when we have had incidents and occasions when we've been tested and we've had to get people to understand what it's about. Sometimes public channels, sometimes we've had to do it closed doors, and then we can explain a bit more the background and what's it all about.
What is clear is that the world is becoming more economically fragmented. With the World Trade Organization paralyzed, Mr. Lee says Singapore needs to continue working with its partners at smaller forums.
There are things like that which we can do. We are doing that in new fields, for example, e-economy. You're talking about data, you're talking about e-commerce, you're talking about rules for data storage, for sharing information, governance, data security. And so you need a new age kind of agreement. And we've got digital economy agreements. I think we have to keep on being active, smaller scale platforms, but to us, these are all the more important.
Singapore's collaborative approach extends to its ties with the US and China. Amid deep-rooted tensions between the superpowers, Mr. Lee says it's fortunate that the city-state has good ties with both. He gives examples like its various government projects with China and its defense relationships with the US. He also cites the Trump-Kim summit in 2018, when Singapore was asked to host the event at short notice.
We are friends with multiple major powers, and we would like them to be here constructively, helping with the security and the prosperity of the region. And the Americans are doing that. And therefore, because we are their friend, when they need a favor and ask us, sometimes we are able to do that.
Turning to ties with Singapore's closest neighbours, Malaysia and Indonesia, the Prime Minister says relations have been complicated but generally good. This has allowed the countries to cooperate and work together to resolve sensitive issues such as airspace and maritime boundaries. In the wider Southeast Asia region, Mr. Lee says ASEAN provides a platform for cooperation amongst member states as well as other partner countries.
ASEAN benefits from a stable, secure region, and ASEAN, I think, helps contribute to a stable and secure region. And that's very important because it's key to Singapore, especially as a small country. Are we absolutely sure that for the next 20 years there will be no war? And I think the answer is we can't be absolutely sure. It could happen, probably not, but things can go wrong. You could have an incident which escalates. You could have a miscalculation. People make a move thinking that the other side won't react, the other side reacts. The first party says, I have to react to the reaction, and then suddenly you find yourself in a new and unintended and dangerous situation. And on a 20-year time frame, that's completely possible. And I think on that time frame, countries have to secure their own security, their own resilience.
But the bloc continues to grapple with the political crisis in Myanmar, which Mr. Lee describes as an old problem that's been around for decades. The Prime Minister says ASEAN's approach of keeping Myanmar as a member state while barring its military leaders from attending meetings has enabled the grouping to continue doing business with partners around the world.
We are trying to engage Myanmar, and we've got the ministers form special little groups and go and visit the parties in Myanmar. And ASEAN settled on a formulation for its approach to Myanmar, which we call the 5-point consensus. And so there is diplomacy to try and nudge things in Myanmar to go in the right direction. But I think looking at the history and understanding the nature of the problem, I think we have to be patient. But fortunately, ASEAN is not held back, so that's a matter which is being dealt with. But to put it in context, Myanmar is an issue for ASEAN to manage, but really for the long term, what is important for the region is war and peace, and what can ASEAN do to contribute to peace in the region.
With Deputy Prime Minister Lawrence Wong set to take over the reins of government next Wednesday, Mr. Lee says it wouldn't be a surprise if the new leadership is tested on its foreign policy stance.
I think that the new team will be probed, certainly, tested. Well, maybe gently, maybe issues will come and people might push a little bit harder, or maybe not. But we must expect that some probing will come, and we must be ready to respond, not in a harsh way, but quietly to stand our ground and let people know that, we may have had a changing of the guard, but the new guards are prepared, and the old guards are still giving, hopefully, useful views to the new team how to do it.
Another test that the new leadership will have to be prepared for is Singapore's approach to foreign talent. Mr. Lee says concerns surrounding values, identity and cohesion are not unreasonable. But Singapore needs such workers to sustain economic growth. There are also certain jobs, like in construction, that Singaporeans do not want to do.
We've got to keep on bringing in talent, keep on bringing in numbers, but in a controlled way, which is good for our economy, which complements Singaporean workers and professionals rather than puts them out of a job, and at the same time which doesn't dilute my social norms and mores and the way Singapore works and cause frictions and conflict within Singapore.
Mr. Lee says he understands that many Singaporeans are anxious about job opportunities. But his reassurance is that the country needs workers, even older ones. He urges employers to adapt and redesign jobs for those in this group and encourages the workers to ensure they can take on roles through the Skills Future movement.